The train brakes screech across the flat Texas prairie. Dust curls in the heat, the metal wheels grinding to a stop. From inside the cars, weary eyes peer out. Eyes that had once scanned tank sites in Tunisia, or squinted through smoke-filled skies over Italy. The men inside are not tourists, not migrants. They are prisoners of war, captured soldiers of Hitler's Wehrmacht, shipped across the Atlantic and dropped into the very heart of America. When the doors clatter open, the first thing they see is not barbed wire or snarling guards. No, the first thing they see is a horse. A tall bay gelding tied to a hitching post outside the station, flicking his tail lazily in the heat. Nearby, a man in a broad hat leans against a fence post, boots scuffed, spurs glinting faintly in the sun. The German prisoners blink hard. Some mutter under their breath. One finally whispers the words half in disbelief, half in awe. Sind we're in America? Oder im Wilden Westen? Are we in America or the Wild West? The scene feels absurd. These were men trained for blitzkrieg in battle. Yet here, the landscape resembles something torn from the pulp novels they had once glimpsed back in Europe. Mesquite smoke drifts on the wind. The horizon stretches endlessly. No ruined cities, no artillery, only grassland and sky. It is easy to forget, in hindsight, just how far these men had traveled. Beginning in 1942, after the Allies swept across North Africa, German prisoners began arriving on American soil. By war's end, over 425,000 German POWs would be scattered across the United States. They were housed in 700 camps, large and small, from Maine to California. But many thousands were sent to the wide, open spaces of the South and the West, Texas, Oklahoma, Wyoming, Colorado. Places chosen for their remoteness, their isolation, and their abundance of land and work. For the Americans who watched them arrive, the sight was almost as surreal. Imagine a cattle rancher in Abilene, watching a line of captured Wehrmacht soldiers march past his front porch. Some still carried themselves with rigid military posture, uniforms pressed despite the dust of war. These were the same men whose armies had overrun Paris, who had thundered across Europe in armored columns. And now they were lining up beneath the Texas sun, guarded by local boys with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. What did the Germans expect to find here? Nazi propaganda had painted a grim picture. America, they were told, was a land of savages. Jewish bankers pulling the strings, cruel guards eager to humiliate and starve their prisoners. A land of jazz, chaos, and racial mixing. Everything the Reich despised. Some Germans truly feared they might be executed upon arrival. Instead, they were handed coffee. One soldier later recalled with disbelief, "We expected torture. Instead, we were given cigarettes and eggs for breakfast." The contradiction was jarring. Back home, Allied POWs in German hands often suffered brutal conditions. Meager rations, forced marches, little medical care. But here in the American West, the Germans discovered something closer to grudging hospitality. Of course, it was not generosity for generosity's sake. The United States was in the grip of total war. Millions of young men were overseas fighting in Europe and the Pacific. At home, farms and ranches struggled to find hands to pick cotton, harvest wheat, mend fences, drive cattle. The Geneva Convention of 1929 allowed POWs to perform non-military labor. The U.S. government saw opportunity. Why not put the prisoners to work? So they were sent into the fields, into the barns, onto the ranges. Men who had once operated panzers now hoisted hay bales. Infantrymen who had marched into Stalingrad now carried buckets of water to cattle troughs. And slowly, against all expectation, a strange relationship began to form. But before work came the camps. One of the largest was Camp Hearn, Texas, nicknamed by locals the Fritz Ritz. Built to house nearly 5,000 Germans, it was less a prison in the European sense and more a fenced-off village. Wooden barracks, mess halls, a theater, even a soccer field. To men who had expected starvation and chains, it was bewildering. Imagine a young German private, 19 years old, stepping off the train. He smells the tang of cattle, the dry earth baking in the sun. Instead of concrete walls and iron bars, he sees wide perimeters of barbed wire stretching into empty prairie. Beyond the fences, ranches roll on for miles. At dusk, he watches dust devils twist across the horizon, while coyotes cry in the distance. The sight is alien, almost otherworldly. One POW later wrote, "The sky was larger than all of Europe. At night, I felt I could fall into it. Inside the camp, life settled into routine. Roll call at dawn. Breakfast, often more plentiful than in wartime Germany. Then work assignments. Some men were dispatched to cotton fields, others to road crews, but many, especially in Texas and Wyoming, found themselves alongside American ranchers. The Americans were cautious at first. These were the enemy, after all. Some guards and locals had lost brothers or sons in battle against these very men. Yet face to face, the stereotypes wavered. The POWs were not fanatical Nazis foaming at the mouth. They were farm boys from Bavaria, machinists from Hamburg, clerks from Berlin. And more than anything, they were hungry for food, for work, for a sense of dignity in captivity. Tensions remained, of course. There were escapes, though most ended quickly. A few men fled, only to turn themselves in days later, exhausted, muttering that the Texas wilderness was more dangerous than any guard tower. One escaped POW reportedly asked a farmer for water, only to be given a glass of lemonade and directions back to the camp. But in those early days, a seed was planted. The Germans began to understand that America was not quite what their officers had described. And the Americans, seeing the prisoners at close hand, realized that not every German was a monster. There was humor, too, unexpected and ironic. One rancher later chuckled that the prisoners sometimes seemed shocked by the abundance of food. Some of them said they ate better in Texas than they ever did in the German army. On Sundays, steak was served in the camp mess hall. One POW was overheard saying with a grin, "If this is captivity, perhaps we lost the war at just the right time." It would be easy to romanticize, to imagine instant friendships blossoming across the barbed wire. That was not the case. Suspicion lingered, and some prisoners remained fiercely loyal to the Reich, even organizing secret Nazi cells within the camps. But for the majority, life here was not about ideology. It was about survival, and about watching quietly as the myth of the enemy gave way to something more complex. The stage was set. Soon, the Germans would not just be observing the American West through the fence. They would ride into it, side by side with men in Stetsons and boots. They would taste dust on cattle drives, feel the rhythm of hooves beneath them, hear the laughter of cowboys who called them boys, rather than Huns. And in that strange crucible of war and wilderness, a fragile human connection would emerge. The question that began with disbelief, "Are we in America or the Wild West?" was about to find its answer. The prairie wind carried the smell of dust and cattle. For men who had marched behind panzer tanks and crouched in foxholes, the noise was disorienting. Instead of the rumble of artillery, there was the low, endless bawl of cattle. Instead of the crack of rifles, the sharp whistle of a cowboy calling his horse. This was the new reality for thousands of German prisoners of war in the American West. Once soldiers of the Wehrmacht, they now found themselves performing a different kind of campaign. Rounding up livestock, repairing barbed wire fences, and hauling bales of hay under the same merciless sun that had hardened the cowboys of Texas, Oklahoma, Wyoming, and Colorado. It was not charity that put them here. By 1943, America faced a massive labor shortage. Millions of American men were overseas fighting in Europe and the Pacific. On the home front, farms and ranches strained to survive. Cotton rotted in fields, wheat went unharvested, and cattle herds risked going untended. Something had to give. And so, under the rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention, German prisoners were pressed into service. They could not be forced into military labor, but they could work the land. For American ranchers, the solution seemed both surreal and practical. Employ the enemy. And so, one by one, the prisoners were bussed out of their camps and delivered to the sprawling ranches of the West. Imagine the scene. A ranch foreman in Colorado hands a rope to a young German who had once carried a rifle at Stalingrad. The foreman grins. "Reckon you'll need this more than your Mauser." The German fumbles with the lariat, stiff as a schoolboy, while other cowhands chuckle softly. The prisoner glares, his pride wounded, but he does not throw the rope away. He learns. Slowly. In Texas alone, by 1945, there were over 200 branch camps where POWs labored in agriculture. They picked cotton under a blazing sky, harvested wheat with sweat dripping into their eyes, and, most memorably, joined in cattle work that seemed drawn from another century. For the Germans, there was astonishment at first. The cowboy was already a myth in their imagination, a figure from dime novels and Hollywood films. To stand next to one in flesh and blood, dust-streaked and laconic, was almost like meeting a legend. One POW later recalled, "The cowboys were not at all like soldiers. They gave orders with a joke and laughed when we made mistakes. But they worked as hard as we did. There were plenty of mistakes." Germans who had spent their lives in cities now tried to herd cattle, often with disastrous results. Some attempted to march the animals in neat formation, as if commanding infantry. The cows, unimpressed, scattered in every direction. Cowboys roared with laughter, slapping their knees. "These boys are more dangerous to cows than the coyotes," one rancher joked. Yet, in time, the awkwardness softened. Cowboys taught POWs how to swing lassos, how to sit deep in the saddle, how to sense the mood of a herd. The Germans, disciplined and eager to prove themselves, adapted quickly. Soon they were riding out at dawn, moving cattle across dusty trails, returning in the evening bone-tired but proud. The work became a bridge. Cowboys and Germans shared meals in the fields. Cornbread, beans, coffee strong enough to jolt the dead awake. Around the fire, language barriers dissolved into gestures, laughter, and the occasional shared song. Some POWs offered German folk tunes. The Americans responded with cowboy ballads. The odd harmony of two worlds carried over the prairie night. The transformation was not just personal, it was ideological. For many Germans, this was their first taste of America outside propaganda. They discovered fairness in unexpected places. Cowboys were not soft. They were tough, unyielding men. Yet they treated the prisoners with a blunt equality. A man who pulled his weight was respected. A man who slacked off was scolded. There was no room for ideology in the branding pen. Only sweat and results. Some ranchers later admitted that they came to admire the German work ethic. Others found themselves surprised by how young the prisoners were. "Just boys, really," a Wyoming rancher recalled. "Most of them were no older than my son. They were just on the wrong side of the war." Numbers tell part of the story. By the war's end, German POW labor accounted for millions of man-hours in agriculture across the West. In Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado, whole harvests were saved because of the work of these so-called enemies. Yet the numbers cannot capture the odd intimacy of those days. An American cowboy slapping a German on the back after a successful drive, or a prisoner laughing helplessly after tumbling from a horse for the third time. There were moments of deep irony. Some Germans confessed that they had never eaten so well in their own army. In Texas, one POW quipped, "We were given steak. In the Wehrmacht, we were given cabbage." Others marveled at the vastness of the land. One prisoner wrote, "The West is not like Europe. It has no edges. The horizon runs forever, and at night, the stars are so many they seem like another army marching above us." Still, not everything was idyllic. There were escapes, though often half-hearted. A few prisoners slipped away during work details, but the wilderness proved more daunting than barbed wire. Without food, maps, or English, most returned voluntarily. One famous case in Wyoming ended with escapees trudging back to camp, sheepishly asking the guards for dinner. "Turns out," a guard joked, "the prairie is a better jailer than we are." There were also tensions inside the camps. Some POWs remained loyal to Nazi ideology, organizing secret meetings and threatening those who spoke too warmly of America. The West, for all its openness, could not erase the divisions carried from Europe. Yet outside the fences, in the fields and on the ranges, work had a way of dulling those edges. Cattle did not care about politics. The ranchers themselves sometimes seemed puzzled by the arrangement. They were not used to relying on outsiders, much less prisoners. But necessity had forced their hand, and the results were undeniable. Crops were harvested, cattle were moved, and ranches survived. When asked about it years later, many cowboys shrugged with typical understatement. They worked hard. That's what mattered. It is tempting, in retelling, to see this as a simple story of harmony. In truth, it was stranger and more complex. These were still prisoners. They wore armbands to mark their status, and guards accompanied them to the fields. They knew that at night they would return behind barbed wire. But during the day, for a few hours under the open sky, they were workers, not captives. One American foreman put it best. Out here, the war didn't matter much. You had a job to do. They had a job to do. You did it together or not at all. The radio crackled inside a mess hall at Camp Trinidad, Colorado. Guards leaned closer. Prisoners froze mid-bite, coffee cups suspended in the air. The voice announced what everyone had been waiting for and dreading. Germany had surrendered. Outside, the mountains stood quiet, cattle grazing at the foot of the range. Inside, the silence was heavy. For the German prisoners, this was not just the end of a war. It was the end of their country as they had known it. Some stared at the floor hollow-eyed. Others muttered in disbelief. A few wept openly. In that moment, the strange truce of the American West felt suspended in time. They were still enemies, but the war was over. And the question of what came next hung heavier than any chain. Over the following months, the process of repatriation began. Trains once again rolled across the plains, this time carrying the Germans eastward, back to Europe. Some would be sent to Britain or France first, forced into more labor before finally returning home. Others went straight to the ruins of Germany. A land shattered, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered by bombing and displacement. But the departure was not always celebrated. For many prisoners, leaving America meant leaving behind the strange comfort they had found here. Life inside the camps, though restricted, had offered food, structure, even dignity. Life beyond the wire had offered something rarer still, human connection. There are countless stories of the final days. In Texas, ranchers shook hands with departing prisoners, thanking them for their labor. In Wyoming, cowboys gathered at fences, waving hats in farewell as trucks carried the Germans away. In Oklahoma, a rancher's wife slipped a loaf of bread into the bag of a young POW, whispering, "For the journey home." For some, the connection went deeper. Ranch families had shared meals with POWs during Christmas. Children had learned songs in German. Bonds, though temporary, had been forged. The idea that the enemy had become a neighbor, however briefly, was not easily forgotten. Statistics again tell part of the story. Of the more than 425,000 German POWs held in America, the vast majority were returned to Europe by 1946. But thousands of them never forgot what they had experienced. In fact, a surprising number later applied to return, this time not as prisoners but as immigrants. Take the case of one former prisoner from Bavaria. He had worked on a ranch in Oklahoma, mending fences, driving cattle, eating cornbread at the family table. After the war, he returned to a bombed-out Germany, a place of scarcity and bitterness. Within a few years, he applied for a visa. By 1950, he was back in Oklahoma, this time with his wife and child, working for the same ranch family who had once employed him as a prisoner. Stories like his multiplied across the American West. The irony was not lost on anyone. Men who had once sworn oaths to Hitler now found their future under the open sky of Texas or Colorado. Some even traded in their old uniforms for denim and boots, their European pasts blending into the mythology of the American frontier. A German memoir written years later captured the sentiment. "We came as captives, filled with fear, We left with memories of freedom, not of our own liberty, but of the spirit of a land. The West showed us that strength can wear a smile, and that even enemies can share bread. There were humorous recollections, too, softened by time. One former POW, returning to Germany, supposedly told his friends, "America's deadliest weapon wasn't the atom bomb, it was cornbread." Another laughed that he'd learned more about cows than about combat during his years in Texas. But not every memory was light. For many, the return to Germany was brutal. Cities were unrecognizable, families shattered. To go from the abundance of American ranches to the hunger of post-war Europe was a cruel shock. Some spoke wistfully of the food, the kindness, even the laughter they had shared with cowboys and farmers. For the Americans, too, the memories lingered. Ranchers remembered the strange sight of German prisoners riding beside them. Children recalled men with accents helping in the fields, teaching them German words for horse or bread. Decades later, oral histories recorded ranch families speaking of the POWs with surprising warmth. One Texan woman, who had been a child during the war, said simply, "They weren't Nazis to us. They were just boys who needed work, like everyone else." History, of course, is never so simple. Not all prisoners embraced America. Some remained bitter, resentful. Some caused trouble within the camps, refusing to work or clinging fiercely to Nazi ideology. But the majority carried away a different impression. That the enemy had not been the monster they were told. That America, especially the Wild West, had been something freer, rougher, and oddly welcoming. Perhaps that is why so many later returned. The official records show that by the 1950s, thousands of former German POWs had immigrated to the United States. Some became ranchers themselves. Others settled quietly in towns, raising families, their accents softening over time. Few boasted of their pasts, but when asked, they spoke of the land, the sky, and the strange kindness they had once found in the least expected place. The story of German POWs in the American West is often overlooked in the grand sweep of World War II. It sits in the shadow of Normandy, Stalingrad, and Hiroshima. But perhaps that is precisely why it matters. It is a story not of battle, but of humanity. Not of tanks and guns, but of cattle drives and campfires. It is the story of how suspicion gave way, not to friendship exactly, but to recognition. Soldiers and cowboys, enemies by every definition, found common ground in sweat and soil, and in doing so, they chipped away at the myth that war must always mean hatred. When the prisoners looked back, many remembered not the fences or the guards, but the vastness of the western sky. The sky that seemed to swallow boundaries, to blur the lines between enemy and ally, prisoner and ranch hand. Under that sky they found, if only briefly, a strange kind of peace. The narrator's voice, steady now, might close with this reflection. History is written in battles and treaties, in maps redrawn and cities destroyed. But sometimes its quieter chapters tell us more. In the American West, during the darkest war in history, captured soldiers and cowboys worked side by side. They were not friends, not truly. Yet they shared bread, shared work, shared laughter. And in that sharing, they discovered a truth larger than war itself. That humanity, even in captivity, can find common ground under an endless sky. And then, a final image. A black and white photograph. German prisoners in worn work clothes, perched awkwardly on horses. Cowboys beside them, hats tilted against the sun. Both groups squinting at the camera, the lines of suspicion softened into something almost like a smile. The war was over. The West remained. And for those who lived it, the memory never faded.